Les damos la bienvenida a este nuevo webinario que tiene por nombre Mamíferos de Norte a Sur. Este webinario, bueno, tiene su origen es consecuencia de la pandemia también.
It's consequence of also from the pandemic.
Como ustedes saben, la AMMAC cada 2 años organiza el Congreso
Like everyone
Nacional
knows, AMMAC every year organizes the National Congress meeting
de Mastozoología,
of Mammal.
pero en el año 2010, ya no sé ni en qué año estoy, año 2019 y 2020, debido a la pandemia,
2018 and 2020, due to the pandemic,
hemos tenido que mover y ajustar los calendarios del Congreso.
we have to move the calendars from the Congress.
El año pasado, como ustedes recordarán,
Last year, like everyone remember,
tuvimos una sesión
we had a session
virtual
like this, virtual session
de 5 conferencias,
of 5 conferences.
y este año estamos repitiendo este
And
formato.
this year, we are doing the same format.
Agradecemos muchísimo
We
a
thank you
todas
so
las
much
personas
to everyone
que están involucradas en la organización de este
that are involved with the organization of this group.
también a nuestros invitados conferencistas.
Also, our invitees from the Congress.
Asimismo, agradecemos
We also want to thank
al CONACYT, Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología,
CONACYT, National Congress of Technology,
por el apoyo financiero para la organización de este evento,
for the financial support to realize this event
a través del proyecto 318576,
through the project number 318576,
la convocatoria relacionada con el fortalecimiento de las actividades
the meeting related to the strengthening of activities
de promoción y difusión de la ciencia.
of promotion and diffusion of the science.
Bueno, en esta ocasión,
In this
para
occasion,
inaugurar nuestra serie de conferencias,
in order to inaugurate the series of conferences,
tenemos el enorme gusto y el honor de contar
we have the huge honor to have
la presencia de la doctora Christy McCain.
the presence of Dr. Christy McCain. Hi, Christy.
Voy a darles una pequeña semblanza de la doctora McCain.
I'm going to give you a little update on Dr. McCain.
Ella es bióloga
She's a biologist
y ahora es profesora asociada del Departamento de Ecología
now. She's a teacher associated with the Department of Ecology
y Biología Evolutiva de la Universidad de Colorado en Boulder.
Evolutionary Biology of the University of Colorado Boulder.
Ella también es curadora de las
She's
colecciones
also a
de
curator
vertebrados
of the collections of the vertebrates
en el Museo de Historia Natural de la Universidad de Colorado.
in the National Museum History of Colorado.
Ella obtuvo su grado de bióloga
She got his graduate of biology
por la Universidad Humboldt del
from
Norte de
Humboldt
California.
University of North of California.
Posterior a eso, trabajó varios años en Honduras
After that, she worked many years in Honduras
como especialista en recursos naturales y áreas protegidas.
as a specialist of national resources and protected areas.
Posteriormente ingresó a hacer su doctorado
After, she started to do her doctorate
en la Universidad de Kansas.
in the University of Kansas.
Allí es en donde Christy y yo nos conocimos hace
That's where Christy
pocos
and
años.
I met a few years ago.
Allí su investigación doctoral fue sobre los
Right there,
mamíferos
your
pequeños
investigation, doctor, was about small mammals
de las montañas en Costa Rica.
from the mountains in Costa Rica.
Ya como doctora, como profesionista,
As a doctor, as a professional,
ella, contratada en la Universidad de Colorado, ella
she
inició su
was hired by
laboratorio
the University of Colorado. She started her own lab
en 2008
in 2018,
y desde entonces, con su grupo de
and since
investigación,
then, her group of investigation
se dedican al estudio de
has been
los
dedicated to the
mamíferos
studies of
y otros
mammals
organismos
and other organisms
de diversas montañas en
from
diferentes partes del mundo.
diverse mountains or in different parts of the world.
Ella aborda preguntas de investigación relacionadas
She can answers questions about related
con cómo los cambios ambientales, los factores de cambio global,
about factors and the climate change
afectan a la biodiversidad de las montañas.
and how they affect the diversity of the mountains.
Asimismo, está interesada en entender cuáles son los factores causales de la biodiversidad de las montañas.
On understanding how are those factors affecting the diversity of the mountains.
¿Cuáles son los factores que determinan las distribuciones de
What
las
are the
especies?
factors that determine the distribution of the species?
Cómo estas
And
responden al
how
cambio global.
these species respond to the global change.
Todo esto para desarrollar
This
teoría sólida
and purpose to make a purpose history
para informar a la toma de decisiones para la conservación de la biodiversidad.
in order to inform the decisions of the diversity.
Además de esta investigación, ella también dedica buena parte
On top of this investigation, she dedicates a big part
de su trabajo para promover
big part of her work in order to promote
el valor de preservar y expandir la investigación
the value to preserve and expand her investigation
que se realiza en las colecciones científicas.
that we do and make in the scientific collections.
Christy tiene más de medio centenar de publicaciones científicas.
Christy has over
50.
50 scientific research, about 50.
Ajá. Y es una investigadora que ha sido muy citada en la
is an
literatura
investigator
científica.
that has been known a lot in the scientific literature.
Christy, muy bienvenida a la AMMAC. Nos da
Christy,
mucho gusto
welcome to
tenerte.
to have you here with us.
Bueno, gracias Enrique y todos para venir.
Thanks, Enrique, and everyone for coming and to listen. I'm going to talk in English. I spoke a little bit of Spanish, but I haven't spoken in a while.
So today I'm going to talk about mammal responses to anthropogenic climate change. And how we'll do this a little bit, I'll speak in English. I'll try to stop a little, give Luis a little time to translate, and then I'll start again. So hopefully we have time to get through everything. Okay. All right, so the topic of the day is mammals and climate change. So first, I'll talk about a study that we did looking at mammals and climate change responses across the Americas. And then we'll transition to a study that we conducted in Colorado on the Rocky Mountains and look at the mammal responses here in Colorado. And then you'll see throughout the day, there's sort of a theme. Other than climate change, I'm also going to highlight how important mammal traits are. So items that mammals have about their physiology or their biology that makes them more or less probable to respond to climate change. Okay. So just a little bit about me first. So just so you have a little background. So I grew up in California near the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so both my parents were high school teachers and very interested in biology. And so that's where I started to have this very early interest in mountains and in mammals as well. So that's the background. And then, as Enrique said, I worked in Honduras for 3 years, doing asistencia técnica. And this was around protected areas and natural resources use and protection. And so that's where I became fascinated with how mountains are different around the world and biodiversity is so different as you change in elevation. And everybody in Mexico knows this incredibly well because of the beautiful mountains that are there in your country. And then after I lived in Honduras, I wanted to continue studying mammals on mountains. And so I did my PhD working on how mammals are distributed along the Tiburon mountain range in northwest Costa Rica. Okay. And so after that, that's where I started studying mountains kind of as a natural experiment. So meaning that we have mountains that have developed at different ages all around the globe. There's mountains in tropical latitudes and temperate latitudes and deserts, on islands, and all different kinds of contexts. And so that elevational change and the changes that occur with elevation and climate and all other kinds of habitats, for instance, is a way that we can globally study biodiversity and climate change on replicated gradients around the world. Okay, so for example, here's one of our kind of a meta-analyses where we started studying and gathering data from all different mountains and studying different patterns about vertebrate biodiversity. And this is showing the vertebrates, but we've done this for insects as well, and lichens. And so we've used these data as well to study responses to climate change. Oh, there we go. Okay, and so I've been working on these global data sets, but I also started working on a specific set of mountains in Colorado in 2007. So this was right before I moved to start working in Colorado. And I'm sure all of you know where the Rocky Mountains are, but just to highlight how incredibly large they are, you can see their distribution here on a map of the Americas, or at least the North Americans areas. And then here is the area that I started working in Colorado. And you can see some of those mountains here. And in 2007, we started trapping mammals. So this is mostly non-volant small mammals. So things like ground squirrels, marmots, a form of a ground squirrel, neotoma, so the pack rats, wood rats, shrews, all of those types of mammals. All right, and so the focus today is, and of course in this early study, we started to ask questions about how humans are changing the climate and then what repercussions that has for mammals around the world. And of course, we know that humans are changing the temperature, right? So you can see that average temperatures on the whole globe have increased. Precipitation patterns as well have changed across the globe, getting drier in some areas, wetter in others. And then, of course, on mountains, there's the really obvious stark contrast where montane glaciers that have been there for centuries are starting to recede due to the warming temperatures. And of course, as we all know, this is humans doing, right? So we are producing energy sources and using energy sources that have global carbon emissions for gas, electricity, land use change. And the result is that temperature then globally is increasing. And you can see that this is pretty marked about 1980 onwards. And so a nice way to see this is to look at this beautiful map video that NASA produced, and it's going to take us through the 1880s for temperature on the globe and go up until about modern day or about today. And the thing to remember that this is anomalies. So meaning that if it's just about the average, then it's a whitish color. And then the bluer it is, it's slightly cooler, and the warmer the color is, the slightly warmer it is. And note at about 1980, this up and down of temperature changes considerably. So early 1900s, right, it's a little bit blue, a little bit white, a little bit yellow, on and off, but no considerable change until about here in the 80s. You can see that the world starts warming up and continues warming and has warmed considerably, right? And so you can see that almost the entire globe, both oceans and land, has warmed, and certain areas, in particular, the northern high latitudes have warmed the most. And so the question that we're talking about today is how mammals have responded so far to this warming of the environment, and in particular, the mountains here. Okay, and so we know that climate is a main determinant of a species niche. So, right, we know that certain mammals are adapted to live at certain temperatures. They're adapted to live with certain water amounts, so in the habitats they live in and the food resources they eat. And so because climate is such a large part of a species niche, that means that changes in climate are going to have repercussions to their populations and their distributions. Okay, so what are some of the predicted responses to climate change? So the main predictions, of course, the most dire one is that a species would wholly go extinct. Luckily, we haven't seen that yet. So, but that is predicted to happen potentially. Things that we have seen so far are local population extirpations. So that's meaning that a local population has gone extinct, but not yet the whole species. So local areas where it was known to occur, it no longer occurs. And then other aspects that are commonly measured responses to climate change are things about ranges. So range contractions, range shifts. So this could be latitudinally, where a species range shifts up, or contracts up to higher latitudes. Could be elevation, where species ranges shifts or contracts. So contracting meaning that the overall range size has declined or is smaller, whereas a range shift, the range might be a similar size, it's just moved. All right, and then other things that are measurements of responses to anthropogenic change include changes in abundance. So you might predict that a species population might decline with warming temperatures. Phenological or physiological changes, so meaning the timing of when they come out of hibernation or when they reproduce, or when they might have other physiological changes tied to season, for instance. And then, so the timing of those might change with climate change. All right, and then the last two are not measured as often, but are predicted to be responses to climate change. And those include things like morphological changes. So you might see reductions in body size, for instance, with warmer temperatures, or genetic changes. So you might see a bottleneck in genetic diversity, for instance, in areas that are responding to significant temperature change. Okay, so those are the predicted responses in the literature and in general about how mammals might respond to climate change. And some of the assumptions people have made, and this is changing nowadays as we realize how much more complex climate change responses might be. But in the past, people have assumed that all animals, indeed all organisms, are probably all going to respond to climate change. And the idea is that, you know, things like models about climate change assume that all mammals will respond similarly and in step with temperature change. So this goes to like species distribution models, SDMs. They assume when you build a model, this is the species niche and it's based on climate. And if niche changes, then all of those factors will change linearly and the species will respond. And the main variant might be that some mammals may respond more quickly than others. But this is a pretty simplistic assumption, even though it's a common assumption across organisms, whether it's plants, insects, or mammals. That things will respond very similarly. But we know now, and we even know from the paleontological record, that things didn't always respond similarly to climate change. So one example really far back, about 65 million years ago, is an example of when climate changed enormously when the Earth was impacted by an asteroid, right? So at the KT boundary, or the Cretaceous Tertiary time period when dinosaurs went finally extinct, right? We know that climate changed enormously due to that asteroid impact. And so paleontologists realized that certain mammal or certain organisms were able to make it through that extinction event, that climate change event, and others weren't. So dinosaurs didn't make it through, but mammals did, and they proliferated and became all of the different mammal lineages that we see today, and some that proliferated and died off, right? And so some paleontologists made this prediction that one of the reasons that mammals were able to survive through the KPG extinction was that they were able to shelter from climate change. So what do we mean by sheltering, and what did they mean? They meant that mammals at the time, right, these really early mammals, the early eutherians, the early metatherians, and some of the monotrines that were still around, they survived because they were all very small, that they were nocturnal, so living, only active at night, and that they were proposed to be burrowing animals, so either having nests or burrows underground. So the idea is that maybe they were able to use those microclimates and that smaller size to shelter themselves from some of this climate change. So some of the worst temperature change, some of the fallout from the asteroid fires and that kind of thing. And that dinosaurs, which were huge, or majority were a lot bigger than mammals, were not able to survive. And the idea being they were too big to live underground and in these burrow systems. All right, so we thought, so this is work I did with my postdoc at the time, Sarah King. And we decided to see if, in fact, if you looked at all of the data that had been gathered for mammals and measuring, definitively measuring some aspect of their response to climate change, whether they would show these traits, that ones that had sheltering traits today are less likely to respond to climate change than ones that are not able to shelter. So to do this study, sorry, Louise, I'll let you catch up. Okay, so in this case, we were looking for studies that measured a mammal response to climate change that wasn't in a very heavily degraded habitat. So there wasn't also significant response to anthropogenic habitat change. And we found 34 papers that did this, and they together studied 120 populations of 70 species of mammals. Okay, and so the focus was North America because almost all of these studies were from North America. They were all, from the US and from Canada. There were only 3 other studies elsewhere that had a measured response that didn't have a large effect of habitat change. Those were all included in the study, but they're very much swamped by the North American data. All right, so what was studied? So these are the species or the groups of animals that were studied. On the x-axis and the y-axis is the number of either species or populations that were studied in that group. And so orange are the populations. So sometimes there were multiple species, a single species studied in multiple places. So like pika on mountains all across the West, for instance, would be here in lagomorphs. And then if you just look at a species per species count, that's in red. So you can see right away, most of these were species of rodents, which is right, the most diverse group of mammals, followed by shrews, lagomorphs, and then there were a few studies of artiodactyls, carnivores, and possums. All right, so what were the responses that were measured? So remember I had that group of responses I talked about before. So extirpation, contraction, range shift. And contraction and range shift, remember, could be either latitudinal range shifts or elevational range shifts. And then abundance changes, phenology, morphology, and genetics. And then the number of populations and their responses. So you can see that the majority of measurements were range shifts and abundance, and then just a few of these others. But the key to look at first here is the black bars are showing you the responses that we would predict from climate change. So as it's getting warmer, you would predict that abundance might decline or that ranges would contract to higher latitudes. But you can also see that some species didn't respond at all, and that's shown in blue. And then there's a few outlier responses where they actually expanded their ranges, or they changed their morphology in a way you wouldn't expect. So those are opposite responses. So throughout this part of the talk, I'll talk about predicted responses that's in line with what you would expect with temperature change. And then these are unpredicted responses or unexpected responses, where they're doing the opposite or they're not responding at all. Okay, so the first thing you'll note is that there's a lot of variability in the responses to climate change that have been measured. Only 48% of the species and populations that have been measured are responding as we would expect to warming temperatures, which to us, to me and Sarah at the time, was really quite remarkable. Okay, so remember, we wanted to test whether some of these sheltering traits would be important. And so what we looked at was whether it mattered what response you had, if it mattered if you were a small or a large-bodied animal, what activity times. So remember, the sheltering thing was proposed to be nocturnal. We looked at nocturnal, diurnal, and flexible. And then some other things about whether you could literally shelter. So do you burrow? Do you nest? Are you capable of hibernation or torpor? So in this case, during the heat of the day. And then lastly, we also included a few biogeographic hypotheses. So this was, right, we know that at the highest latitudes are warming the most. So we wanted to see if, in fact, those mammals at the highest latitudes were responding the most. Similarly, at high elevations, mammals at the tops of the mountains are predicted to respond more just because they don't have a lot of area to move into. And then the last one is an important one to think about, is are you on the edge of your range? So particularly think about if you have a large latitudinal range, the populations of your species that are at the southern edge of the range might be already at the edge of the temperatures they could tolerate. And so those might be more susceptible to additional warming. So you might have different predictions at the southern range edge, for instance, than you would at northern range edge. Okay, so the data. So we used all of the data together, all of the responses I showed you in those figures, but we also used a best subset. So a subset that really we felt was the strongest test of a climate change response without an effect of any other kind of anthropogenic issues. So we compared all species and then the best subset. And then we also compared a group that looked at those things that maybe were saying, oh, these species are at risk of extinction. And so those measurements were the tests for local extirpations, tests for range contractions, or declining abundance. So we thought those were linked to having more extreme responses or higher risk for climate change, decimating populations. And then the statistical analysis are kind of tricky, but the main thing to think about is that we used a binomial response. So meaning, did they respond to climate change as we predicted, or did they not respond as predicted? So not responding would be that they did better or they had no response. And this phylogeny is here because you might be thinking that we needed to account for the relationships among species. And so we did that through running, so we ran logistic regressions, and then because we had a binomial response, but to take into account the phylogeny and relatedness, we ran phylogenetic multiple logistic regressions. And I'll show you those with ordinary logistic regressions. All right, so the first thing that came out of the models as being the most important is truly one of these sheltering hypotheses. So body size was the main determinant of who responded and who didn't respond to climate change. So to orient you here we have body size on a log axis. So tiny shrews down here to big things like caribou up here. And then remember, this is a logistic regression. So 0 means they didn't respond as we thought they should, and 1, they responded as we thought they should. And here's all responses and the best subset. And you can see that on average, that as you get bigger, you're more likely to respond negatively to climate change. And that's also, okay, so the ordinary least logistic regression is shown in red, and then the phylogenetically corrected one is in black, and you can see they're almost identical. So there wasn't a big phylogenetic signal. And then if you just looked at extinction risk measurements, same thing, really extreme responses to climate changes if you're bigger, and less response if you're smaller. The second most important thing was when you're active during the day. So if you are obligately diurnal or nocturnal, then you responded much more consistently to climate change. But if you are an animal that's flexible, like a lot of shrews and voles, that can say if it's winter or cold temperatures out, they'll be active during the day, but if it's really hot, they'll be active at night. So those species are the ones that were not responding to climate change as much as those that had to be active at a particular time. And then the third thing that was important for the whole data set was latitude. So it was true that things that lived at the highest latitudes were responding more to temperature change than were things at lower latitudes. But remember, there is an issue here where, say, Mexico, Central America, tropical areas have not been measured as much for climate change. And then the last thing to note is that we looked at just elevational things, so just studies for mountains, and we found that species that are high or mid-high elevation species were contracting their ranges, and that low elevation things tended to be expanding their elevational ranges. Okay, so the take home here is just that a couple of things. One, that there's variability in responses to climate change, and we have to think about that because that's important if we're going to predict who responds in the future that we haven't measured. And that sheltering traits do seem to be important, especially if they influence the climate that a species experiences. So here's just to show you that from these little pictures, that a caribou stands above the vegetation. They have to be active in all temperatures that are being displayed in the environment because they're bigger than the vegetation. Whereas something like a vole, it has these microclimates that it can live in, within the vegetation that are separated somewhat from the overarching, say, warming temperatures. So similarly in a nest or underground. And then if they can pick and choose when they're active, then they're experiencing a different environment. That might allow them to pick and choose microenvironments that are different from the overall changing environment. All right. So the take-home messages from this first part are that climate is indeed impacting animals, mammals in general, but not evenly, and that we need to study more about their physiology and their interactions with these traits and microclimates to really better predict who's responding and why other things are not responding. And clearly, we need more studies measuring these responses outside of the US and Canada. Okay, so the last part of the talk is about Colorado mammals. So this is work that we've been doing for the last decade and a half, looking at mammal responses to climate change on the mountains in Colorado. So as in those previous studies, they had to have a historical data set to compare to. So early mammal researchers collected specimens all over Colorado, and those are in museums all over North America and actually beyond. And so what we did is we built a database of specimen records for all the species of Coloradan mammals. And we broke those into two groups, ones that were collected before climate change started, so before the 1980s. And then we compared that to a contemporary data set that we collected ourselves with trapping. So live trapping, pitfall trapping, and diurnal observations with binoculars and transects. And so in this case, we were doing mark and recapture mostly, but we also did specimen collections because some of these could not be determined for species in hand. Okay, and so just to reiterate, right, on a mountain, if it gets, you know, at the bottom of the mountain, it's warm, and as you hike up the mountain, it gets cooler. And in a warming climate, then the same temperature that occurred here is going to occur at some mid-elevation. So the expectation then is if species are responding to that temperature change, they should be moving their niche and their populations to track that temperature change. So say you're a mammal, pre-climate change, this was your distribution. And then post-climate change, you've moved up. So this would be a shift in elevation. The size or elevational size of your range is about the same, but you've moved up. Similarly, you might have had a large elevational range at the top of the mountain or mid to top of the mountain, and then, whoops, I went the wrong way. And then it contracted to just the very tip of the mountain. So that would be a contraction. And then we could go through all of the options there, but these are the main ones we're looking for in a response to climate change. All right, so this is where we worked. So here's the state of Colorado, and the mountains are the majority of the western side of it. And here is the San Juan Mountains, or the part of the Rockies called the San Juans. And this is the part of the Rockies in Colorado called the Front Range. And we had these 4 elevational gradients, where we did most of our study. And these are the species that, or most of the species that we examined their responses. So these weren't all of the mammals that we had data on, but these were the mammals we had enough historical data on to compare to contemporary data. All right, so there were 7 ground squirrels, 2 tree squirrels, 4 chipmunks, a whole bunch of voles. Here's our beautiful redback vole. A bunch of mice and wood rats, and then 4 species of shrew. We have more of each of these, but these were the ones we had enough data for. Okay, and these were all the sites we used. There's a lot of sampling and a lot of specimens. So all of the round circles are the historical sampling localities. And then all of the stars are our contemporary sampling localities. So those also included contemporary ones in museums from 2005 onward. And some sightings, of course. So just to give you an overview of what the historical data look like, this was about 4,600 specimens from 1886 to 1979. And then our contemporary data was trapping efforts across all of these years, and then specimens in museums from 2005 to 2008 from these two mountains, and that totaled about 7,500 records. So you probably noticed that there's a different sampling effort contemporarily as there were historically. Of course, there were more people working on mammals contemporarily, but to get at that influence of sampling, what we did was we built Bayesian models, so hierarchical Bayesian models. And why we did this, and you can see here from this figure, is for each mountain, Front Range, San Juans, we had historical data shown here. These are the number of specimen localities from each elevational bin, historically and contemporarily, and you can see that it's not continuous. There's places we sampled and are historically were well sampled and others that weren't. And so how we got around that, or how we built that into our models, is that we built these Bayesian models for each mountain range during each time period. And we incorporated the overall sampling at each elevation, the abundance of that species at each elevation across each time period and on each mountain. And then we incorporated an estimate of the probability of their detection. And that was based on our trapping or observation probabilities. So this is complicated statistics, but the bottom line for you to remember is that we tried to take into account variability in sampling. And so when you look at a species elevational range, you know, what's the probability we didn't see it a little bit on either side because we didn't sample there. And that's essentially what we tried to estimate. Okay, so how I'll show this is that on the x-axis, there's 3 species shown. That's just their names here, abbreviated. And elevation is on the y-axis. And the historical data is shown in black. So each of these black bars is historical data. The absolute measured data from the specimen records or the contemporary records are shown in the thick bars. And then the thin bars are our model extensions. So the Bayesian model said, okay, there wasn't that much sampling right here at the edge. So we predict that that species lived at those places and was just undetected. So when we do a comparison, the colored ones are the contemporary ones and the black ones are historical. And so you can see this contemporary one actually expanded downward with the contemporary sampling. So this would be an example of something that shifted down or didn't show any response at all. So those are in gray. You can see that they're very close statistically. There was no change in their elevation ranges. And then there were some that shifted upward. So you can see that the blue contemporary trapping showed them much higher than they were historically, and that they were extirpated from their lower parts of their range. And then there were ones that contracted upward. You can see much smaller, higher population contemporary to historical, or expanded upward. So that is the data for the Front Range that I just showed you here. And then this is the data for the San Juan Mountains shown here. So remember, those red and gray are showing you unexpected responses. Green and blue are showing you the expected ones, the movement upward. And so overall, 26 of the mammals that we studied shifted to higher elevations as expected. And you can see this here. This is just an average for each elevation on each mountain. And if they lost range, if mammals lost range, they're in a red or orange or yellow. And if they gained range at that elevation, they're in blues. And so you can see that this is essentially tracking elevation, that at low elevations, there's losing ranges and gaining ranges at the highest elevations, which have less overall area on the mountains. So overall, that mammals shifted up by 130 meters, which is considerable and in line with the amount of temperature change. But the most worrying thing was that the majority of responses were actually montane species. So of the species that lived at mid to high elevations, 75% of them responded to climate change, and their average range shift was about 350 meters. So this is considerable and more response than temperature change. Okay, and then overall 6 did not change. 11 moved to higher or to lower elevations that we wouldn't predict. Most of these were low elevation species. And then 4 went extinct. We knew that they were there historically, but they have not been seen since the 80s or before the 80s. All right, so you might be asking, why isn't this just habitat change? We know that humans are living in these areas, and why aren't these shifts just a response to changing the environment? And so we tested that by looking at associations between extinctions and the amount of habitat change. So in red here, you see areas of habitat change. And those over here you can see are developed, high intensity, medium intensity, low intensity, open space like pasture. And you can see that it's very concentrated. In the Front Range, there's not very much at all in the San Juans, and that's predominantly at the very lowest elevations. And when you compare that to gains in elevational range or losses in elevational range shown in red, they're not correlated. So there's obviously some effect of habitat change in here, but it's not correlated with the overall trends in gains and losses. And partly this is because all of our sampling, or most of our sampling, was in protected areas. So protected either as a national park, national forest, state or county protected areas. So we can't eliminate all effective habitat change. It's definitely going on here, but the predominant signal that we're measuring is with temperature change. So as you get cooler, you see more expansions, and as you get warmer down here, you see more extinctions. All right, and again, why are some responding and some aren't? Well, it's again the same thing about traits. So in this case, we found slightly different traits that were important. So for one, we found that being montane was the most critical trait. If you were already cold adapted and living at high elevations, then you were most likely to respond. And then the second thing we did find in the other study as well, we found a latitudinal trend. So what does this mean? Well, this means that species that had latitudinal ranges that span to high elevations. So here's one of the biggest shifters. So this is Zapus princeps, or the Western jumping mouse. It shifted upward or contracted upward 250 meters. This is its latitudinal range. And you can see that it occurs at high latitudes, and that these populations in Colorado are at the southern edge. So it turned out that if you're montane, you have a large latitudinal range that reaches to high latitudes, and you're at the southern edge of your range, you are most likely to be responding in Colorado. So, and from those traits being montane, high latitude, and at the southern edge of their range, those indicate to us that these are cold adapted species. So they're high latitude at low elevation, but at low latitude, they're at high elevation, that they're not doing as well with climate change. And you can even see this if you look at the diversity pattern. So this is just the diversity pattern historically in black and gray contemporarily of the species we measured. And here's elevation increasing on the x-axis and the number of species. And you can see that the whole curve is shifting to higher elevations. So that, again, showing that species are being lost towards the bottom of the mountain and being gained at the higher elevations. All right, but there's some good news, right? Some things are not responding as we would predict. Some appear to be able to shelter from climate change. And so a lot of these are things that are adapted to hot desert conditions, for one. And two, they tend to be the things that are most abundant already in the environment. But overall, the story is not so good, right? A lot of species are shifting their ranges considerably upward in elevation. And eventually, right, they're going to run out of area. So you can see on the Front Range, our highest elevations, there's not that much area for them to be living in. The San Juans have a little bit more high elevation, but still, as you get higher in elevation, I showed this mountain here, Fiji, you can see you get less and less area as you get higher. So that's a worry that over time, they're going to have less and less area to sustain their populations. Okay, so what can we do as individuals and as scientists? Well, as scientists, we can study this, but also as individuals, we can do our part to try to decrease the curve of temperature change. And there's many things we can do. We can just tell people about this. We can also vote. We can vote for people that are willing to change our emissions. And then, of course, we can do things like reduce and recycle and embrace solar alternative energies or use transportation that does not emit as much fossil fuels. So, of course, we all knew this. This is just about doing it and getting our governments to do it. But we still have the possibility to change that direction of the curve of temperature warming. Okay, so thank you so much for coming and listening, and for this being in English. And these are my funding sources, and I will take any questions that you might have.
Muchas gracias, Christy. Ha sido una plática muy interesante. Muchas gracias. También queremos ofrecer una disculpa a los que solamente te estaban viendo por Facebook, porque allí no funcionó la traducción simultánea.
Okay.
Se escuchaban tanto a ti como a Lewis hablando, entonces lo hizo un poco más complicado.
Oh, okay. Lo siento.
Pero bueno, abrimos entonces el foro para las preguntas. Zaira, te paso la palabra para que por favor le hagas las preguntas a Christy.
Claro que sí, muchas gracias, Enrique. Bueno, una de las primeras preguntas que tenemos aquí es que hay estudios como el proyecto Grinnell, en el que se ha evaluado las respuestas de los mamíferos y otros grupos al cambio climático. Los resultados muestran que las respuestas no siempre son como se espera. Por ejemplo, subir de elevación, incluso algunas especies han respondido a lo contrario. ¿Qué determina que algunos mamíferos respondan como se esperaría y otros no?
Bueno, Luis, no sé. Creo que entendí.
Me parece que Lewis está apuntando la pregunta. Sí nos pidió un poco de tiempo. Lewis, ¿nos escuchas?
Dr. McCain.
Christy, ¿tú escuchas a Lewis haciendo la traducción? Do you hear Lewis?
No. ¿Me escuchas, Enrique?
Sí, yo te escucho, Lewis. Christy, sí.
Christy can hear me. A ver.
If you set your interpretation icon down in the screen, if you turn it off, you might listen, Lewis. Let's try.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Okay, so there are here goes the question. So there are some studies, research. Sí, yeah. So Dr. McCain, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so there's some studies or researchers called Grinnell. They evaluate the mammal response to the climate change. Some responses are not what we were hoping due to the elevation. Some changes, some go higher or lower. What do you think causes those changes to be like that, unexpected?
Yeah, so the Grinnell data were included in our overall big study. Their study was included so that the Moritz and Jim Patton data as well that's from the Yosemite transect. And so yeah, similarly, they found that at the time they couldn't explain it very well. But when you looked at in the bigger context of all the different studies, that there was an effect of body size and an effect of being diurnal or flexible. Of course, with body size, there's also some influence of reproductive characteristics that are correlated. And so it looks like some of these sheltering traits were important.
Okay. Bueno, ahora, ¿ya me escuchan en español?
Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Bueno,
de entrada
Sí.
hay muchos saludos y felicitaciones por la plática, muy interesante. Otra pregunta es, ¿cómo se esperaría que respondieran los mamíferos de zonas no montañosas al cambio climático? Por ejemplo, de las especies de la península de Yucatán, acá en México, que es tropical y plano. ¿Hay estudios en zonas tropicales?
No, adelante, es que sí, que sea la interpretación en español de la respuesta de Christy, por favor.
Sí. Y ahorita seguimos con la otra pregunta, ¿vale?
Sí, ahorita seguimos con la otra pregunta.
Ok, bueno, entonces con la respuesta de la primera pregunta, si la información del estudio de Granelle se hizo grande, es un estudio grande, es una información similar donde realmente lo que analizamos fue el tamaño del cuerpo y si eran flexibles para ver si podían estar en la noche o en el día, si eran diurnos o nocturnos, y también la característica de reproducción. También se analizó mucho el tema de la protección de cada especie. Ok. Listo, ahora sí me puedes hacer la segunda pregunta.
Sara, ¿puedes
Sí,
hacer la segunda pregunta, por favor?
Sí, otra vez.
Sí, lo comento nuevamente.
Sí.
Mencionaba que de entrada hay muchos saludos y felicitaciones por la plática. Y la pregunta es, ¿cómo se esperaría que respondieran los mamíferos de zonas no montañosas al cambio climático? Por ejemplo, de las especies en la península de Yucatán, que es tropical y plano, y si hay estudios en zonas tropicales.
Sí, entiendo. Sí.
There are any studies of the mammals that are not from the mountains, for example, in the peninsulas of Yucatan, where it's tropical and it's a flat area. Are there any studies for those type of mammals?
Yeah, so since that study came out, which that study was published in 2014, there's been more studies. I don't know of any in particular from the Yucatan Peninsula. There are a few studies from Central America in particular. There's a few from Africa and Asia and a couple from the UK and Europe. That are from flat areas, but and looked at different responses. And so some of those have found responses and others have not. But we haven't gone back and done a reanalysis of that. There was a paper we published in the Journal of Mammalogy that added a few more studies. I think the biggest problem with a lot of Central American and tropical areas like Africa and Brazil is that there's not as good of resources for the historical data to compare to the contemporary data. And so a lot of the studies are say just during the climate change period. So we might have data from the 90s and you compare it to now. So it's not quite as similar to what we compared in the past, but there are mammals from low elevations responding to climate change.
Bueno, entonces, la respuesta, ¿ya me escuché en español? ¿Listo? ¿En español?
Sí, escuchamos.
Listo. Sí, desde el 2013 se hizo un estudio y se han hecho más estudios. No sé particularmente con la península de Yucatán si hay algún tipo de estudio. Sé que se han hecho estudios en algunas partes de América Central, África, Asia, el Reino Unido y algunas partes de Europa donde las áreas son planas. Algunas respuestas han sido diferentes, unos han respondido, otros no. Realmente no hemos vuelto a reanalizar, pero hay un papel de un estudio que se hizo en Centroamérica, África, bueno, entonces del estudio que se hizo. El problema principal que más hay en América Central, África, Brasil y zonas tropicales es que no hay recursos históricos, o sea, no hay historia suficiente para poder comparar los cambios climáticos. Entonces, se está trabajando solamente con información de los 80, 90, información contemporánea, no es tan similar como otros lugares donde pueden hacer comparaciones con información histórica.
La siguiente, Zaira, por favor.
¿Qué se sabe del cambio climático y los murciélagos norteamericanos, siendo especies que perchan e hibernan? ¿Se ha detectado algún cambio en el inicio o menos tiempo hibernando para ellos?
In North America, are the bats having to hibernate less time? How is their impact?
Yeah, good question. I forgot to mention that there haven't been many studies on bats in North America for whatever reason. None of these data sets included bats. So there are a few studies from Europe, and there's one from Costa Rica on bats and responses. They are indeed responding in some cases, but there haven't been enough studies to kind of do one of these synthetic things about who is and what traits mediate which bats and which bats are and are not responding.
¿Listo? Es una buena pregunta. Realmente no hay tantos estudios, no sé por qué, no los hemos incluido tanto. Sé que hay algunos estudios en Europa y Costa Rica, pero obviamente sí están respondiendo unos y otros no, pero no hay tanta información suficiente con los rasgos en sí de ellos.
La siguiente, Zaira, por favor, es que Zaira está teniendo problemas en escuchar a Lewis, entonces no sabe cuándo ya puede hacer la traducción.
Oh, qué pena. ¿Repito?
No, está bien, es solo Zaira.
Okay.
La siguiente pregunta es, el cambio climático no es nuevo para la mayoría de las especies, ya que en el Pleistoceno hubo al menos 10 ciclos glaciales interglaciales. ¿Cómo es que las especies de clima frío lograron sobrevivir a los eventos del calentamiento anterior?
Por favor.
Zaira, ¿puedes repetir la pregunta a Lewis?
Claro que sí. El cambio climático no es nuevo para la mayoría de las especies, ya que en el Pleistoceno hubo al menos 10 ciclos glaciales interglaciales. ¿Cómo es que las especies de clima frío lograron sobrevivir a los eventos del calentamiento anterior?
Okay, doctor. So, climate change was not new for the majority of the species in the Pleistocene. There were 10 cycles of interglaciers. So the question is, how did those species survive the cold weather and the change after that?
Great, yes, another good question. So the main thing to think about is that the time period, so that over which change occurred. So in the Pleistocene, there were thousands of years between glacials and interglacials. And so the species could respond quite incrementally to the temperature change. Whereas now the temperature change is much, much faster in the scale of hundreds of years or tens of years, where we're having similar amounts of temperature change. The animals have to respond extraordinarily quickly. The other thing, I'll let you answer, Luisa, say that, and then I'll have a second thing.
Okay. Bueno, Liz, entonces, que es otra buena pregunta. Lo principal es que durante el periodo del Pleistoceno hubo muchos miles de años entre la ciclo glaciar e interglaciar, y ahora el cambio es mucho más rápido. Luego los cambios son diferentes porque todo va a mucho más velocidad.
Yeah, and the second thing is that the mammals in fact did respond very precipitously to changes in the Pleistocene. So there's paleo evidence of them moving their distributions up in elevation, down in elevation, up in latitude, down in latitude with those temperature changes. And an interesting aspect that ties in with what we found here is that those species that did not make it through the Pleistocene, so the last glacial maximum, there was an extinction event, and that was almost all the largest mammal species. So again, that was a body size distribution of who responded most negatively and went extinct, and those were the biggest body sizes.
Bueno, entonces, okay. Listo. Entonces también en los animales hay paleoevidencia de que muchos mamíferos sí tuvieron cambios o respuestas. Algunos tuvieron cambios en elevación, más alta, más baja, otros en latitudes, cambiaron. Y también sabemos que esas especies que no que no lograron sobrevivir a los cambios de temperatura, fueron los más grandes. O sea que el tamaño tuvo mucho que ver también en los cambios que ellos tuvieron, y los que respondieron negativamente fueron los más grandes.
La que sigue, Zaira, por favor.
La georreferenciación de secuencias genéticas se han utilizado para estimar la exposición de la diversidad genética de los mamíferos terrestres en el clima futuro debido al cambio climático y el uso de suelo de la Tierra a una escala global. Estamos interesados en hacerlo a una escala local o regional. ¿Cree que pueda ser posible hacer esto?
Otra vez, Zaira, por favor. Otra vez.
Dila por partes, Zaira, por favor, porque está muy larga, entonces si la puedes decir en dos partes para que Luis pueda hacer la traducción.
Primero hago el planteamiento y después la pregunta. La georreferenciación de secuencias genéticas se han utilizado para estimar la exposición de la diversidad genética de los mamíferos terrestres en el clima futuro debido al cambio climático y el uso de suelo de la Tierra a una escala global. La pregunta es, ¿estamos interesados?
Espera, hasta ahí para que le traduzca a Christy y ahorita haces la pregunta.
Okay. So, Dr. McCain, it's going to go in two parts. It's a little long. So the first part is explanation. The question goes after. So the first part says, the georeference of genetic sequences has been utilized to try to estimate the exposition, the diversity of the genetic related to the future change in the weather at a global scale. Did it make sense, Doctor? Or again? No, okay. So, says,
¿Puedo ayudarle aquí?
Sí, por favor.
Christy, this person is asking that your referencing of genetic sequences has been used before to estimate the exposure of genetic diversity of mammals to the future climate and land cover change in the future too. And this is a citation of Spiros, of Theodoridis and Carsten Rabeck and David Nogues Bravo. It's a paper. And then he asks that they are interested in doing at the local and regional scale this type of analysis. Do you think it's possible to do it?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's going to be a challenge what your prediction is. So I have not read that paper. But so a lot of the predictions about genetic diversity have been about losing genetic diversity with climate change. So, you know, the obvious would be a genetic bottleneck where species are only certain individuals are able to maybe colonize a potential place or then are lost in other places. So predicting into the future, yeah, I'm not 100% sure how that might work. Obviously, you could do these kinds of studies, but it would really have to be super carefully planned about what you're actually measuring with genetic diversity. So are you looking for a decline in genetic diversity, an increase? Because we know today that many species have maybe unpredictable amounts of genetic diversity related to climate. And so I think it would have to be very carefully planned.
Ok. Bueno, entonces dice, sí creo que sea posible. De todas maneras sería un reto poder hacer una predicción. No he leído el documento, el papel. De todas maneras, dice perder, el hecho de perder la genética y la diversidad de la genética por especies individuales. No estoy segura si se pueda predecir o no. Puede ser que colonicen o se pierdan en un área determinada. Se pueden hacer este tipo de estudios, pero se debe tener mucho cuidado en hacerlos por el tipo de la diversidad genética, porque hay muchas especies que tienen cambios impredecibles.
Gracias. La que sigue, por favor, Zaira.
El cambio en las diferencias altitudinales en los mamíferos que se estudiaron podría estar relacionado al sexo de los individuos colectados, es decir, que haya miembros de uno de los dos sexos que se muevan más en las diferentes altitudes.
On the changes on the mammals, on the latitudes, do you think it has to do with their gender, if it's a male or a female, meaning that one can move around different than the other one, like the male versus the female?
Sí. Yeah, interesting question. So we looked a little bit at different distributions of males and females in the populations that we studied. And we didn't find trends that were different about the populations themselves. But the critical thing to remember is that these movements elevationally or latitudinally are not individuals. So it's not like Henry, the tiniest vole that we found. It's not that Henry gets up and moves higher to higher elevations. It's that Henry's whole population at one edge reproduces more and moves higher, and the lower edge reproduces or dies off more and is lost. So they're not necessarily about individual movements. They're more about population growth or decline across the range, which are both sexes.
Bueno, listo. Entonces, si no hay realmente un cambio de distribución individual, no se hace el tipo de rastreo por individuo. Quiere decir que si cualquier tipo de población se va a mover, siempre se analiza todo en grupo. Entonces, tanto hembras como machos se mueven a diferentes lugares, ya sea más alto, o digo, más hacia un lado o hacia el otro, o más alto o más abajo, pero no es individualmente el asunto, sino tanto hembras como machos.
La que sigue, Zaira, por favor.
Bueno, la doctora Eli Arellano dice que gracias por la charla, Christy. Y pregunta, ¿tu muestra actual fue casi el doble de la histórica, pero los resultados muestran una pérdida de diversidad actual versus la histórica? ¿Puedes comentar algo al respecto? ¿Se puede tratar de una buena muestra actual de individuos, pero no de especies?
¿Me la vuelves a leer, Zaira, porfa? ¿Otra vez? Qué pena.
Zaira, ¿la puedes volver a leer, por favor, para Luis?
La pregunta es que si de la muestra actual, la muestra actual fue casi el doble de la histórica, pero los resultados muestran una pérdida de diversidad actual versus la histórica. ¿Puedes comentar algo al respecto? ¿se puede tratar de una buena muestra actual de individuos, pero no de especies?
Okay, doctor. So your data is double of the data, the historical data, in which we can see a loss of diversity, the actual diversity versus historical diversity. What can you tell us about that? And do you think it shows more data individually or from a species?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, good question. So in this case, we did not do a response of abundance across time. So we didn't ask historically, have these species become less abundant? And in fact, overall, we did, as you said, had more individuals that we sampled contemporarily than we did historically. But remember, our response variable was the elevational ranges. And what ends up happening with an elevational range is that the critical specimens are the ones at the highest and lowest elevations. And so, you know, they could be really abundant in the middle, either historically or contemporarily, but they're changing in elevation. And so, I don't know if I'm explaining this quite right. Do I have a figure? So for instance, this particular species, let's do this. So this particular species has contracted its range to a higher portion of the range from historical. These are the data that all the species we tested, but we didn't feel that the historical data was good enough. So in this case, they could have had really few individuals, but the elevational range was big. So maybe you had 10 individuals, but they were all spread out here. Here we could have had 100 individuals that were sampled, but they were much more abundant in different places along here. So it could be that the species is doing pretty well at those sites, but has lost numbers at these other places. So the abundance versus the species range are just two different measures of how a species might be responding to climate change.
Bueno, entonces la doctora decía que es una buena pregunta, que no hubo una respuesta a la abundancia, el tipo de abundancia históricamente no bajó. Sí tiene sentido que se han hecho más estudios individuales históricamente y dice ella que los cambios de elevación son críticos para los que viven más arriba y para los que viven más abajo de la montaña, por ejemplo. En la mitad encontramos más abundancia. Igualmente hay cambios con la elevación. Entonces después se refería al diagrama y hablaba que al lado derecho necesariamente puede haber cambios individualmente, pero no necesariamente en abundancia como especie.
Y bueno, una última pregunta es si en un mismo lugar las especies que fueron a latitudes más bajas pudieron haber sido desplazadas por aquellas que fueron a latitudes más altas.
Some studies, the species that move to lower latitudes, is there a possibility that they move because other species move to a higher latitude where they were before?
That's possible, yes. So in fact, in Colorado, we have a species that is moving southward latitudinally, the Wyoming brown squirrel, that it lives about 100 or 200 kilometers south of where it originally was found. And the reason that it's going farther south is because its main competitor, the black-tailed prairie dog, has been extirpated. So they're not moving north because of climate change, but they've been extirpated because of their burrow systems and cattle production. So they've been killed. And so there is an instance where the Wyoming ground squirrels are moving south because a competitor has been removed. So it's true that there could be these really unique biotic interactions that change, and might be why you see different, elevational shifts for some species and not others in directions that we wouldn't predict. So yeah, really interesting question. And that's one of the things that we've been working on more recently, is trying to estimate these biotic interactions with range shifts.
Muchísimas
Muchas
gracias.
Christy, muchas gracias, Luis, por la traducción. Ya no hay más preguntas. Hay varios mensajes de felicitación, Christy, que ha gustado mucho tu plática. A nosotros también nos ha parecido muy interesante y muy bonita. Luis, no hay necesidad de traducción ahorita porque Christy entiende bastante bien el español y lo habla bastante bien. No más que le da poca confianza hacer una exposición profesional, digamos, de su tema en español, pero lo entiende muy bien. Agradecemos a todos los presentes aquí y en Zoom y en Facebook Live por su participación, por su interés. Claro que a ti también, Christy, por haber aceptado nuestra invitación. Es un honor para nosotros. Gracias a todos por su presencia y les mandamos muchos saludos de parte de toda la asociación. Buenas tardes.